I'm just getting, all right, so I'm just getting everything arranged so that I can see my slides and also see people. All right, so what we're going to do today is, I'm not sharing yet, am I? Sorry about that. Okay, can you see my PowerPoint slides now? Okay, good. So what we're going to do is obviously talk about second language vocabulary acquisition. And as you commented, Judy, it's something that's a lot less finite than grammar acquisition, where you can sort of figure out all the grammatical structures, but vocabulary learning ideally continues for quite a long time, not only in your second language, but also your first language. Now, a lot of research has been done in this area, but not a lot of the research has looked at vocabulary learning beyond the sort of initial stages. So my main goal for today is to provide a sort of more holistic account for second language vocabulary development. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of what we know about the initial stages of learning vocabulary, which involve sort of mapping meaning with form, but then I'll move on to talk about development beyond that, because I feel like this is a sort of neglected area of research, not only from a second language acquisition perspective, but also from a teaching and pedagogical perspective. So I'm going to start off with, so we will be talking about semantics. I'm going to start off with a meme, because apparently that's how people communicate in the modern world. I need to thank my graduate student, Najma, who's here, for sharing this with me. But go ahead and have a look at that. So yes, we are going to go to that dark place of semantics. We're going over to the shadowy place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, again, second language acquisition before I move on to some sort of recommendations, all right? All right, so starting off talking about sort of the three main challenges I see with second language vocabulary acquisition. And the first one we'll talk about is this thing I mentioned a moment ago, this sort of initial acquisition of form, L2 form, and linking that to meaning. Then I'm going to move on to moving from sort of an L1 to L2 based conceptual understanding for words. And to be clear, in this lecture, I'm going to be sort of using a concept as synonymous with semantics. So in some researchers make a distinction between conceptual knowledge and semantic knowledge, but for this lecture, I'm going to basically use those as synonymous. And then I'll talk a little bit about the development of metaphorical senses after the sort of acquisition of core senses. So I'll jump right in with, I have conclusions and recommendations at the end. So I'm going to jump right in with sort of this initial acquisition of form and meaning. Now, I think for all of us, probably most of us have learned a second language to some extent. And the first steps of learning a second language are fairly second language vocabulary, I mean, are fairly self-evident. So of course you have to learn the phonological orthographic forms, and then you have to link those forms with appropriate meanings. Now those are, of course, can be distinct because we'll know a lot of forms like, words like I've heard that word before, but I can't remember what it means. That happens, of course, in our first language as well. And in this area, we have sort of two main lines of research that have been done. One is in the area of incidental vocabulary acquisition, and the second is in intentional vocabulary acquisition. And in recent years, we've seen really a lot of work more in incidental than intentional vocabulary acquisition. I'll explain what these mean if you don't know, and give you some of the advantages and disadvantages of learning second language vocabulary in this way. So incidental, as the name implies, incidental vocabulary acquisition occurs when vocabulary learning is not the primary goal of your endeavor, your studying or whatever. So you might be reading a text for comprehension, or maybe you're just reading a text for fun, or just whatever. And you come across a new word, and through the process of reading, you acquire the meaning of that word. Now, this has several advantages from a second language vocabulary perspective. One is that it embeds the words in very rich informative context. And second language vocabulary researchers like to talk about vocabulary knowledge sort of along two dimensions. We have breadth, which of course is the number of words you know, and then depth, which is how well you know those words. So when you come across words in these informative contexts, it helps you recognize some of the things like the collocations, some of the connotations. So for example, recognizing that a word like pushy has a negative connotation, where a synonym like persistent is less negatively laden. So those sorts of things can come through learning words in context. And of course, it can also occur concurrent with other learning activities. So maybe you're focusing on, reading comprehension, but as an extra bonus, you also manage to acquire some new vocabulary. And some would say this is a more enjoyable way to learn because you're learning in sort of contextualized language, not just, learning off of word lists or something like that. Now, obviously, those are some advantages, but as I said, there are some disadvantages as well. And the most foremost amongst these is that people are just really bad at remembering vocabulary, especially in incidental settings. And our brains are doing a lot. Our brains are pretty busy, and remembering things is not always particularly easy. But when you look at studies that have looked at reading only, where they've basically just given them, here's a text, read the text, and then after you read the text, you have a surprise test, and we'll see how much vocabulary you acquired from reading this text. Generally speaking, the immediate gains after the reading are pretty low, oftentimes, 6-7%. So, and even cases where, like, the learners have read rather extensive text, their retention of words they've read is really quite low. So it's not very efficient in that respect. And additionally, the long-term retention, as you can imagine, is even worse. So I'll show you some results from one study that was done by Waring and Takaki. And it's a fairly small scale study, but it was a nicely designed study. And what they did was they had learners read a text, and they varied the number of exposures. I'm going to go ahead and get my laser pointer out. So they varied the number of exposures to the words. So some words appeared 15 to 18 times, some 13 to 14, 8 to 10, 4 to 5, and some appeared just once. And then they tested their knowledge of forms and meanings and stuff like that. This test here was their meaning test. So they basically gave them the words they had encountered and asked them to translate them. And you can see the immediate post-test for like the 15 to 18 condition is pretty good. They retained 42% of the words, and it gets a little bit less, although you have a bit of anomaly here with fewer exposures. But look, 1 month and even 3 months later, we can see after 3 months, the 15 to 18% number of exposures only has 6% retention, and everything else is 0. So basically, these learners read these texts, and they retained very, very little knowledge from these texts. Now, one thing that I've contended, and sometimes in a way that's not very popular, is that some of this research might be sort of based on some faulty premises. And, second language acquisition is riddled with assumptions based on first language acquisition that haven't played out well in second language acquisition. So I think one thing that has sort of happened in this field is, as we know from learning our first language, we're able to assemble a pretty large vocabulary without a lot of obvious conscious effort. So we don't often read, sometimes we'll go to dictionaries and stuff, but most of the vocabulary we've just learned through exposure and input. And some researchers in my area contend that the only way that a second language learner can assemble a sufficiently large vocabulary is through incidental acquisition. And I'm certainly in favor of incidental acquisition, but I'm not sure that it's actually a very efficient way to learn a second language vocabulary. So I sort of feel like they're maybe over applying something from first language acquisition to second language acquisition. And I'm developing a study right now that I'm sort of working on with one of my former students that sort of looks at this question of how efficient incidental acquisition is. And what we've sort of done is we've sort of said, okay, let's take a novel and we sort of analyze this novel using I think we used Wordsmith, which is sort of a corpus tool, and see what the distribution of words in that novel is in terms of their word frequency. And then imagine that we've given this to 50 people with different vocabulary sizes and have them read and determine how many words they acquire from this experience. So it's basically a number of computer simulations. We just sort of take the average number of acquired words from these simulations. Now, I need to sort of add a caveat here, and this is in the very early stages of development. So our algorithm for estimation still needs some tweaking and some revision and stuff like that. But what we found is we fed in the novel, the electronic novel, H.G. Wells's The Invisible Man. And you can see here that if your vocabulary size is 2,000, which of course is quite small, you're going to not recognize 1,463 of the words in the text. And now, according to our estimates, you acquire about 58 words. But this is probably generous because in reality, the unknown words account for about 60% of the words in the text. So if you only understand 40% of the words in the text, there's no way you're going to comprehend the text. So these are probably very generous estimates, but even still, the percentage of acquisition is quite low. So, I mean, I would contend that input is essential for language learning, including vocabulary learning, but I would contend that maybe we should move away a little bit from incidental vocabulary acquisition and think about more sort of old school methods like intentional acquisition. And I'll talk a little bit more about this towards the end too. So let's talk just very briefly about intentional acquisition. And this is sort of the, learning off a word list, things like that. Now, research that's been done on this has demonstrated that it is more efficient than incidental acquisition in terms of retention. So, if you, I think Batya Laufer did some studies where she compared these two and found that I think the gains through intentional learning were twice as much or more than incidental. So it clearly has some advantages just in terms of helping people remember the words, but it is decontextualized, so it doesn't sort of promote that depth of word knowledge. And some would argue that it's kind of tedious. I can understand that argument, but I would also say it's kind of a matter of your personal taste. So, so I want to sort of leave that there, but this is just sort of the groundwork for the first challenge in learning a word in a second language. So we're going to move on from that and talk a little bit about development beyond that initial stage. So I'd like to now, for now, assume that the learner has successfully learned that the second language form and linked it to its meaning. So is this place we could say, okay, is vocabulary acquisition is complete, you've learned the form, you have the meaning, you're done. Well, probably not, or at least not in some cases, or in many cases. In some cases, you're probably sufficient with that, but in many other cases, you're going to need to develop your knowledge beyond that. So I'll talk a little bit about this second point, which is L1 to L2 based conceptual understanding. So going back again to this idea that we start off by mapping sort of an L1 based meaning to an L2 form, and then we sort of have a sort of hybrid entry for our lexical entry, or hybrid understanding of that lexical entry. So I'll start off by presenting you with a model, which is one of several, but it's a fairly concise and straightforward one by Zhang. And I apologize for my pronunciation if you're a speaker of Chinese, but he suggests that in the early stages of learning here, learners will just have a sort of vague idea of the word form, the phonology and orthography, without really any links to the meaning. So this is just sort of that very early stage where you like, I know this word, I've heard it, I know how to say it, but I don't know what it means. Stage two then is where they start to link their L2 forms with L1 based knowledge. And he says they tend to link it with, learners tend to link it with L1 based syntax and semantics. We'll talk mostly about semantics here, since that's the main goal of the discussion. But this is sort of like your stage two, where you have a sort of hybrid entry where you have, again, an L2 form, but it's mapped to an L1 based meaning. The third stage is where you displace this L1 based knowledge with L2 based knowledge. And at this point, you have an understanding of a word that is equivalent to that of a native speaker of the target language. However, he argues, and he presents quite a bit of evidence in favor of this, that this third stage often doesn't occur. And instead, we're stuck with sort of this stage where we have a second language word, but it's mapped to a first language based meaning. Now, all of us who have studied a second language, which I assume is probably everybody here, know that this is a problematic situation because, as we know from translations, translation equivalents are not always conceptually equivalent, right? So if you go and look up a word in the dictionary, you'll get the best translation in the other language, but the best translation is not always completely in line with the meaning between the two languages. And Pavlenko discusses sort of three general scenarios for overlap between L1 and L2 based concepts. She talks about equivalence or near equivalence. She talks about partial non-equivalence, and then she talks about full non-equivalence. And I'll show you some slides after this to sort of give you a visualization of how these things work and how they can vary and how they can affect our acquisition and understanding. So the first scenario would be full equivalence or conceptual equivalence. And this is, of course, the ideal situation where the L1 word or the language A word and the language B word are basically mapped to the exact same concept. So when you learn that second language form, you've essentially learned the second language meaning as well. And this does happen sometimes, but as we know, it's not always the case. So moving from that, we have something called conceptual near equivalence. And here you can see that you have quite a bit of overlap. So, I mean, mostly the concept linked with the language A word overlaps with the translation equivalent for the language B word. And in these cases, probably your knowledge is not quite the same as a native speaker, but it's close enough that you will never know the difference, and neither will anyone that you're talking to, even native speakers of that language. So it's probably not going to cause you much trouble. Now we have different parts or different forms of conceptual partial equivalence. One is where you have sort of less overlap. So you have sort of words that are translations, but they don't quite cover the same amount of territory in terms of what they, the sort of semantic value of them. And this is probably less common than the next type, which is conceptual partial equivalence. And in this particular case, this is also conceptual partial equivalence, but this is where the meaning of one language subsumes the meaning of the other. So you have a word in language A that is broader in meaning than the translation equivalent in language B. And I will give an example from Japanese. And one thing you learn fairly early on in learning Japanese is that the Japanese has about 5 or 6 words for the English word wear, W-E-A-R, like wearing clothes, depending on how it's worn on your body. And if you go to like Google Translate right now, when you type in the English wear, you'll get the translation kiru, which is the most standard form of wear in Japanese. But it doesn't work for things like a watch. So there's like, what is it, hakeru for a watch and haku for pants. So it depends on how you put it on. You pull it on, do you put it on your head, do you hang it on like glasses? So you soon learn that Japanese word kiru is really not conceptually equivalent with the English word wear. Instead, it's a sort of subsumed in the English word wear, which has a much broader semantic footprint than the Japanese equivalent form, again, the dictionary equivalent form of wear. So this is a type of partial equivalence where, again, you have this sort of subsumption of one language's meaning into the other language's broader meaning. Now, the last one I mentioned is conceptual non-equivalence, and this is pretty straightforward. Language A has a word and an associated concept, which is absent from language B. So, I mean, obviously, you can't have any overlap when that occurs. And Pavlenko, who initially developed these ideas, I think she's a Russian native speaker, Russian, and she mentions the example of the word privacy, and she says that Russian has no lexical or conceptual equivalent of the word privacy, so they have to sort of learn those things concurrently, both the concept and then the meaning of the word. So that's different forms of conceptual overlap or non-overlap. So it's probably best to think about this as more of a sort of continuum rather than discrete classifications. But you got to go from sort of like complete overlap to something that is completely absent from the other language. All right. So, and of course, the converse is true as well. You can also have language A with no word, no concept in language B. So I'll move on from there. So we've gone back and we sort of mentioned early on that learners will often map L2 words to L1 based concepts. And we also mentioned that this can also be the sort of final form that they acquire for that particular word, where they sort of don't move beyond that second stage that we saw in the model to the third stage, which would be, sort of fully native-like understanding of that word. Now, the impacts of this can vary depending on how much overlap there is between the L1 and the L2 based concepts. So in cases where you have a conceptual equivalence or near equivalence, it's obviously going to cause very little problem because the meaning you have is close enough that it's again, not going to cause a lot of difficulties in communication. Conceptual non-equivalence is the last form, and research has shown that this is actually more problematic than equivalence, but actually not as hard as you might think. Because when you're acquiring that second language word, you're sort of acquiring a new concept with it. So you're not sort of filtering it through the concepts you have that are already formed through your first language. And another good example I think of from Japanese is the word, gambaru or gambarimasu, which is really hard to translate into English because it's such, it means sort of do your best, good luck, keep it up, don't give up. It's very broad meaning, but it's a very commonly used expression, very, very commonly used expression in Japanese. And I think most people who learn that can very quickly figure out what it means and sort of develop an associated concept, even though we don't have quite the same concept in English. Now, the one that causes the most problem then, of course, is the third category here, which is the conceptual partial or partial non-equivalence. And as I mentioned before, sometimes it's not easy to recognize this mismatch between your your L1 based meaning and a native speaker's meaning, and that can lead to fossilization. So you might have a situation where you are using a word in a certain way, and it's not quite right from a native speaker's perspective, but you don't ever realize that. So it's kind of like if you've seen The Princess Bride, it's a bit like this situation, right? Where you're using the word, but it doesn't quite mean what you think it means. And I'll give you an example of this from my own experience in teaching Japanese. And when I was teaching Japanese, it was quite common for my learners to say, oh, my room is very narrow, or I have a very narrow room. And first time I heard that, I thought, okay, well, they probably have a narrow room. It's like long and not wide. But when I heard 4 or 5 learners say that, I thought, okay, I don't think that word means what you think it means. I thought this is probably not quite in line with my understanding of the word narrow. So I sort of thought, okay, why did they keep using the word narrow? Because Japanese has a word for small, which would work just as well. But they weren't using the word small. It wasn't like there was an absence of an equivalent word in Japanese. It was just their preference for the word narrow. Well, as you can probably guess, the English narrow is the same, the translation for that. And again, you can check this in Google Translate. The English narrow is translated into the Japanese word semai, but they don't mean the same thing. Narrow is when the length or height, of course, in English is much greater than the width. But semai in Japanese encapsulates the English narrow, but it also can just mean sort of small in general. So in some cases, their rooms might have been perfectly square, but they were still calling them semai. But it could also just mean cramped. So you might have a very large room, but have a lot of stuff in the room, and you could still describe that room as semai because it feels very cramped. So what we have here, of course, is an example of partial equivalence, where the Japanese based concept for semai is much broader than the translation and the concept associated with English narrow. But the learners had mistakenly, they basically linked the L2 word narrow with their L1 based Japanese concept for semai. So they were using the English word with a Japanese-like understanding of that word. Now, a question that sort of occurs here is this necessarily a permanent state? So I did say this could lead to fossilization, but the research on this topic is not uniform. So sort of thinking about whether or not this is sort of your permanent state, you're sort of fated to have your first language understanding of the word forever. Some research says no, it's not permanent. And there's a couple of studies that I've looked at these sort of conceptual changes with proficiency. And some says, yeah, it seems pretty permanent. And there's some really interesting work that's been done by Miriam Goldberg, where, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, but she looks at gestures and how people gesture when they are speaking their second language. And one study, she looked at Dutch speakers, and I guess Dutch has like 2 different words for like on the wall versus on the table. It's two different prepositions. And sort of looking at how people who were maybe native speakers of English using Dutch, how do they gesture? They gesture with sort of like on the wall or things like this. So what she found is a lot of times the gestures would match their first language meaning. So her takeaway was basically that seems to be kind of a permanent state, even for advanced learners. They still have an L1 based understanding of this word. And of course, Zhang also, who developed that model we saw earlier, also has some evidence to support this. This is something I wanted to explore as well in a recent study. So I teamed with a couple of my collaborators, and we wanted to look at this link between proficiency and conceptual understanding. And we were trying to basically determine whether or not your conceptual knowledge changes as you gain proficiency. And we leveraged this difference between English narrow and semi to see if native speakers of Japanese learning English would change their conceptual understanding of the word narrow as they gain proficiency. So what we did was we presented participants with pairs of room images, and I'll show you some examples of this in just a minute. And we had three groups. We had an L1 English group that had English instructions, so using the word narrow. We had a Japanese L1 group with Japanese instructions using the word semi. And then our experimental group was the Japanese learners of English with English instruction, so doing it in their second language. So again, these were sort of our two control groups, the native speakers with their native languages. And then our experimental group was these Japanese learners who received English instructions. And we asked them, depending on which language they were given instructions in, to either choose the more narrow room or the narrower room or the more semi room. And we measured their choices, which room did they choose? We measured their reaction times, and we also measured their eye movements. Now, unfortunately, the eye movements weren't very informative, and that's something that needed some refining. But the other results, I think, were very informative. So what are our expectations based on what we know about the English word narrow and its Japanese translation equivalent? Well, the expectation was that the English-speaking group would be more affected by width differences. So you ask a native speaker of English, which room is the narrow room, they're going to pay attention to the width of the room. You ask a Japanese speaker the same question using semi, we would expect them to be more affected by size differences, since again, the Japanese semi has a broader conceptual footprint than English narrow. And of course, the L2 learners, the third group, which we call the JE group, we didn't really know. That was obviously why it's an empirical question. So, if they were similar to the English group, then we could sort of say, okay, they've changed their conceptual understanding. If they were similar to the Japanese group, we'd say, no, it's still based very much on their Japanese conceptual understanding. And there might be something in between where the change from Japanese-like understanding to English-like understanding was linked to their proficiency. So I'll show you some examples of some items that we had, and these are taken from the test. So you can look at that and you can tell me which room is more narrow. So you might not be too sure of your answer, and I think it's the right one here. But the key point here is you're spending some time looking at it and thinking about it, which is what we want. We want this to be a challenging test. So you have a few examples where you have ones like this, and you have one like this. You can also see which one you think is more narrow. And then you have ones like this. And I think this third one is actually the same width. So it's kind of cruel, but we asked native speakers of English to say, okay, which one's more narrow, when you had two rooms that were actually the exact same width. So what we did was we wanted to sort of measure, we had three different types of differences in width. We had it based on pixels. So 30 pixels was a large difference, 15 was a medium difference, and we had the same width. And what we found was the expected sort of marked the difference between Japanese speakers with Japanese instructions and English speakers with English instructions. And as far as the JE group was concerned, the Japanese speakers with English instructions, they were between the two groups in terms of their performance, and proficiency did seem to be sort of a key factor in predicting their English-like behavior, or the extent of their English-like behavior, with the obvious, the obvious trend of the more proficient they were, the more they sort of used an English-based conceptualization rather than Japanese-based. So just give you a very brief overview of some of the results. So just in terms of the percentage of narrow rooms chosen, this excludes the rooms with the same width. We can see the English speakers, they chose the narrow room most of the time, 80% of the time. The Japanese speakers with Japanese instructions, it was about half the time, a little bit more. And then the Japanese with English instructions are a little bit higher than the Japanese with Japanese, but are still quite close. Now, we also looked at response times, and I'll show you this slide here, which shows how long they took to respond to the different width differences. So this obviously shows the same width difference, which I guess there's no difference, but the same width, medium difference, and a large difference. Now, what this shows here is the reaction time. So a slower reaction time indicates that was a more challenging task for you. So the pattern for the English speakers is quite as expected. So it took them longer to recognize, to respond to the ones with the same width difference, less time for medium, and then less time still for the large difference. The Japanese group here, they don't really have that same pattern, but the Japanese English group sort of does seem to have that same pattern, even though it's not as pronounced as it is for the native speakers of English. They do tend to sort of follow the same pattern of taking longer for the narrow room and less time for the medium room and then the large room differences. Now, when we look at this against the background of proficiency, it becomes much more clear what's happening. And what this shows is response time, and this shows the proficiency. So what we can see here, the 0 is basically your average proficiency, and then everything lower than that is below average proficiency for this particular group. I don't mean average in general; they were all fairly proficient, but and then you have people who were above the mean. And you look, for example, at the same width difference. Now, again, if they're approaching this task like an English speaker of a native speaker of English, you would expect them to get slower as the size difference got less. And that's exactly what we see here. We can see that the lower proficiency learners responded more quickly when it was the same width difference, whereas the more higher proficiency ones, they took longer to respond. So again, what it shows here is that the more proficient learners are processing this more like a native speaker of English, and the less proficient learners are processing it more like a native speaker of Japanese. And we see the opposite trend here with like the large width difference. So the lower proficiency people took longer to respond, and the higher proficiency speakers took less time to respond. So again, this idea that it seems to be sort of conditioned by proficiency. So our conclusion basically is that conceptualization, at least in this study, seemed to be very much conditioned by proficiency, with the obvious direction I mentioned before. The more proficient learners tended to be more like native speakers in their conceptualization of the English word narrow. Now, this isn't consistent with all studies in the past. I mentioned the studies by Goldberg and Zhang, and they found that there was not a shift to native-like understanding of the words. But I think it might be related to this very old model we have for the sort of hierarchy of difficulty in second language, which many of you will be familiar with if you studied second language acquisition all the way back to 1965. And this is actually developed for grammar, but I think it works for vocabulary as well. But those two studies I mentioned that didn't find a difference, they were basically looking at differentiation where the L1 has a single word and the L2 has two words for the same concept. And those are always very challenging. And I'll give you an example again from Japanese. Japanese has a single word for quick and fast. And so it's quite hard for Japanese learners to be able to distinguish between quick and fast. But if you're a native speaker of English learning Japanese, you're down here. So it's quite easy because you just have to learn one word for the two words. So I think what I had here was something sort of like partial correspondence. And so those are quite easier to acquire than maybe when you have this total differentiation. So that's kind of a theory I've been working with, and just thinking about maybe fossilization depends on the type of difference we have between the L1 and the L2 lexical forms and meanings. All right, so I'm going to move on now to talk briefly about core and metaphorical senses before I go on to conclusions and recommendations. So I'm going to start off with a question, again, sort of a second language acquisition question, which is what makes a word easier or harder to acquire? Now, as you can imagine, this has been investigated at some length by research in the area. And they've come up with some answers. They say length is one thing, cognateness, imaginability, how abstract versus concrete the word is, and frequency, how highly frequent is the word. And the assumption behind frequency, which I want to focus on in particular, is that higher frequency makes it easier to acquire than lower frequency. And this is generally true. The higher frequency words you'll encounter more often. They're also more useful words since they are used more often in communication. But I would like to propose sort of an alternate answer, which is that it depends a little bit on your definition of acquisition and how you're looking at word acquisition. And what I like to do is I'd like to show you a slide of words of different levels of frequency. And what I did was I took a corpus and I randomly chose words, English words in the 1 to 2K range. So the first 2,000 most frequent words of English, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and 4 to 5. And then I went to WordNet, which is an online lexical database developed by Princeton University. And I said, okay, how many different meaning senses, how polysemous are these words of these different categories? So although we consider that we tend to consider higher frequency words easier to acquire, when you look at the number of senses, they're a lot more polysemous. Now, of course, this is a very small sampling. I'd have to do this a larger sampling to make it more compelling. But we can see that these, on average, have 20 different senses, which goes down to about 8 and 7, and get down to the 4 to 5K words, even though they're the lower frequency. They have much fewer meaning senses, so they're less polysemous than the higher frequency words. So again, the conclusion is pretty self-evident. The higher frequency words tend to be more polysemous than the lower frequency words. Now, starting from that, I'd like to take a look at one of the words we looked at, which is cover, which we said had 36 senses. And I prepared just concordance lines from a corpus, from the COCA, Corpus of American Contemporary English, for cover. And if you read through some of these, you can sort of see a trend. And when you look at, for example, cover a 5 to 7 year period, you covered a lot, covering a project. And you can see that we have a couple examples down here where cover is used in a very literal sense, right? So there seem to be from recipes, cover and let steep at room temperature, cover and refrigerate. But I think without excluding those two, I think everything else is using cover in a more metaphorical sense, not talking about literally covering something, but covering something in a more non-literal way. And these are just randomly chosen, but this one really caught my eye. It says, city police who cover a smaller area, it lets deputies get naked busting hotel calls. I need to follow up and see exactly what that is, the context for that. And I thought deputies had exciting lives, but I didn't know they're quite that exciting. But anyway, that sort of shows us that a lot of times cover is used again in a non-literal way. So one difficulty this poses for second language vocabulary learning is that the metaphorical extensions tend to be less shared across languages. So if I learn the word read in any language, I'm pretty sure I can use a collocation like read a book, and it'll be correct. But I don't think I can use read as in read someone's mind, because that's obviously a less literal meaning of the word read and a more metaphorical one. Same thing with carry a bag versus carry a disease. So I think in the first case, we have very concrete usages of these words. But in the second case, we have something that's more metaphorical, and those are less likely to be shared across languages. And that's shown in, I sort of altered this. This is a model, it's called the distributed features model. And this was adapted from Kroll and Sunderman, who adapted it from Helen de Groot. But they mentioned that, sort of conceptual words, or concrete words, I mean, the conceptual level will have lots of similarity with the lexical, whereas abstract words, you'll have less conceptual similarity. But I would argue that that's also true for concrete words when it comes to abstract senses. So when we look at the sort of concrete senses of like read, it's going to be pretty shared across languages. But when you look at abstract senses, those are going to be less shared across languages. So the conclusion here is sort of that high frequency words are easy to learn initially, but they might actually be more difficult in some ways because of their tendency to be very highly polysemous. But obviously, like in the case of cover, we can see that the literal meaning of that is not used nearly as often as the metaphorical meaning. So going beyond that literal meaning is very important to say you fully acquired that word. Now, not a lot of research has been done in this area. The couple studies that have been done have been sort of longitudinal studies where they've looked at learners in immersion environments and sort of tracked how many senses they acquired for some high frequency words. And they have shown that there's not a lot of progress. So learners, even I think these were both in, one was in a US university, one was in a British university. So even after like a year of studying in an immersive environment, they didn't actually acquire very many different meaning senses. They made some progress, but not a lot. So we need more research in this area to sort of figure out why do they have a hard time acquiring these senses? What can we do to improve it? And this is something that I'm kind of working on now. So I'm sort of developing some research in this area to sort of investigate that. All right, so I'm going to come to the last thing, which is the conclusions and recommendations. Now, some of the conclusions are fairly self-evident. And one is that vocabulary acquisition in second language is challenging. It's hard. It's hard to develop that initial meaning form link. It takes a lot of repetition. It takes a lot of forgetting and re-remembering. It's hard to develop a second language conceptual understanding as well. So once we even learn that word, you might think we understand it pretty well, but perhaps our understanding is not quite on par with the native speaker. And it's also quite hard to develop a knowledge of easy high frequency words to a deeper extent. So we're just beyond the sort of the literal meaning into the other meanings. So my recommendations are going to be pretty self-explanatory as well. One is to pay attention to vocabulary. Now, I probably don't need to tell that to anyone in this group, but 40 years ago, believe it or not, vocabulary was considered something that just sort of took care of itself. And second language acquisition research was focused exclusively on grammar. We've moved away from that now, but I think as teachers and learners, we have to be very conscious of making sure we're recycling vocabulary. We have a vocabulary well integrated into our curricula and things like that. I would also argue that we need to merge intentional acquisition with a lot of input. I don't, again, as you might have seen, I don't really trust incidental acquisition alone, but I think input is very important for refining meaning of words. So we need to have a focus on intentional learning, but supplemented with lots of input to understand, to develop basically that depth of knowledge as well. Obviously, we should view vocabulary acquisition as an ongoing process. So you shouldn't think, okay, I've acquired the form and the meaning, I'm done, because it should go beyond that for a lot of words. And we should take advantage of corporate-based information to sort of refine our understanding. And data-driven learning is, it's been used more with advanced learners, but there was a pretty good meta-analysis done by Tom Cobb and Dalton, I think it was, where basically they looked at 65 studies that use data-driven learning. And in this case, most of them, they just gave students like concordance signs like we saw before and said, okay, here's a word, cover, read through all of these concordance signs and sort of try to figure out what this word means. So just not trying to give very subtle definitions of the different non-literal senses, but letting the learners sort of infer it from the text themselves. And that's been shown to be fairly effective. I also think it's worth trying to understand second language semantics through collocations. And another quote from a British linguist named J.R. Hirth is, he said, "You shall know a word by the company it keeps." And so his contention was that meaning is not what defines collocations, it's collocations that define meaning. And in a sense, I think I sort of exemplify this by sort of working with my students in Japan. So sort of, they had to refine their understanding of the word narrow, but I also had to refine my understanding of the word semi through that process. And I realized, oh, okay, semi does not mean narrow. And we can sort of see this when we look at a corpus. And this is from a study that I'm revising right now. What we have here is we got this information from a Japanese language corpus, and we typed in semi, and here are the Japanese collocates, and here are the English translations. And then we looked up the English translations in the COCA to see how frequent they were. You can see there's some overlap. You can see, narrow street and road, they're both very common. Narrow range was also common. But we also can see that there's some, like 4 of the 10 here, that appear in the Japanese corpus don't appear at all in the English corpus. So you can sort of conclude from that just by looking at the collocations that Japanese narrow and sorry, English narrow and Japanese semi don't quite mean the same thing. Now let's look at, this is, actually, I should have changed it. So it shouldn't say semi, it should be the Chinese, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I don't speak Chinese, but yeah, we did the same thing with the Chinese word for narrow. And again, the same thing, here are the top 10 collocates, and here's how they, the translations, and here's how they appear in English in terms of the COCA rating. So we can see here a lot more overlap between the Chinese word for narrow and the English word for narrow. So just by looking at the collocational patterns, we can sort of conclude that the Chinese word is much closer in meaning to English narrow than is the Japanese word semi. And my coworkers, or not coworkers, my colleagues who worked on some of these papers, one of them speaks Chinese and Japanese, confirms that this is the case, that the Chinese word is more in line with English narrow than the Japanese semi, okay? All right, so that's it. We went there, we discussed semantics, and I think that's about all my time. So any questions for me?
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Wolter. That was wonderful. Yes, we have some time, a little bit of time for questions. So if you'd like to raise your hand using the reactions function. Okay, let me just quickly go through, because I see one person who's raising their hand visually, but I want to make sure no one's raising their hand. Yes. Okay, Tae Chong.
Yeah, my name is Dan Chong. I am at MTSO ASU. I really like the second language vocabulary acquisition. And when I research a lot of project, I understand that the incidental language vocabulary acquisition is primarily good first language learner instead of a second language. And because the first language, the vocabulary is substantial in first language student. But now we are interested that incidental vocabulary acquisition is introduced to second language also. And do you agree that the first language vocabulary, first language learner is substantial in incidental language acquisition instead of second language? Second language incidental learner?
So let me make sure I understand your question correctly, or your statement. So I think what you're saying is that if you're effective at learning vocabulary in your first language, you'll also be effective in your second language. Is that correct?
Yeah, is it incidental vocabulary acquisition is for first language learner.
I get what you're saying. So if you're good at incidental acquisition in your first language, you'll also be good at it in your second language. Mm-hmm. That I don't know. I mean, I tend to think that most of us are good incidental vocabulary learners in our first language because we do tend to amass a large vocabulary without a lot of conscious effort, you know, just through interaction, reading, and things like that. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, some of us have larger vocabularies in our first language than others. But, you know, that might just be the type of exposure you get. Maybe you just, I mean, if you continue reading throughout your lifetime, you're likely to continue to expand your vocabulary. If you finish school and, you know, don't really read anymore, then you're not going to be able to build a large vocabulary. But I don't know of any research that's looked at that specifically. I know of research that's looked at vocabulary size in the L1, and whether that was a good predictor of vocabulary size in the L2. But I don't know of any research that's looked at effectiveness of incidental acquisition in the L1 and the L2 for the same people. So do you know of any studies that have done that?
I review a lot of research, the studies, and in my class, and a lot of recommending incidental language vocabulary acquisition in second language, but in general belief is that incidental vocabulary language acquisition is normally prevalent in first language learner. That's what I say. It's a general speaking, generally
Yeah.
speaking.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So there's a question in the chat. Cheyenne, would you like me to read it out loud for you, or do you want to read it, or I can? Okay, okay. Do you think that learning multiple languages makes it easier to understand the semantic differences between words? For example, language A word may differ with language B, but is similar to language C.
I mean, I believe so, but I think part of that's just through learning experience as well, right? And obviously it depends a little bit on how closely related languages are too. So as you know, Korean and Japanese are fairly closely related. So if you learn Japanese and learn Korean and you learn the sort of the Japanese-based meaning, then I think it'll be easier to understand the Korean one. So I mean, again, I don't know about any research that looks at this, but I would certainly assume that learning a third language, you know, having the experience of learning the second language would help you to maybe just be a little bit more aware of this difference in conceptual space between languages, and probably help you do better at you know, learning the semantic differences between the different languages and words.
Great. Other questions? Yes, I think Ebru. If you have a question, can you also please try using the reactions, so that, because there's quite a few pages of participants, but yes, Ebru, go ahead.
Hi, Brent. Thank you for this excellent talk. Thank you. I don't think this is necessarily a question, but I would like to comment on the polysemous words. It seems like it's not something that we provide an organized or constant input to students. And just like in your presentation, the most frequent word seems to me, seems to be the most polysemous ones. But majority of the textbooks, especially the ones that we are using, the input is not provided, not a sequenced way. I was really hoping that at least, of course, this is, it depends on the context, but at least the first 5 extended meanings should be provided. And also the other perception that I have received is it's always the concrete ones. The primary meaning comes first, which is true in most of the cases. But for some adjectives, that's not necessarily the case, to my sense. So the polysemous, some of the polysemous meanings, or 1 or 2 of the most polysemous meanings, are in fact the ones that are most frequently used. And somehow native speakers expected, L2 learners to be able to make that connections or relations. But something that should be, I think, improved in the input in terms of, I don't know, for the textbook or classroom activities. So yes, I truly agree with you. It's something that we should look at. But again, our sources are limited. Recently, I'm also, I don't want to be too negative, but I feel I'm losing my belief to some of the corpus. They get outdated, and they don't include too much variety, or the genre is not most of the time reliable to language teaching. Especially nowadays, we put more importance of speaking. The comparison doesn't right to me. The corpus, which the genre could be most of the time, depends, but still, we don't have that much variation for corpora content too. So are we making the correct comparison or also for the input? Yeah, so just lots of things coming to my mind. These are the topics that I'm very interested in, and also as a teacher too. But mine is mostly some type of comment rather than a question. But thank you.
I mean, I have a couple of comments on that. And I mean, a lot of the foreign language corpora aren't as developed as the English corpora. So like the COCA, of course, you can choose a subcorpora. And I found that like the fiction corpus, subcorpus, is actually quite close to spoken language, much more than, I mean, a lot of it's like, if you have the spoken corpus, a lot of it's like TV interviews and stuff like that, which doesn't really resemble conversation. So I think maybe as we get those refinements and as teachers, we can like sort of say, okay, I want to focus on speaking. What subcorpus best represents, the use of these words in a speaking context? I mean, the other thing I wanted to mention was, you said the books don't tend to present those non-literal meanings. And obviously in this lecture, I'm suggesting that we need to go beyond that. There's also an argument to be made for, at least in the early stages of learning, not overwhelming students too much with too much information. And I'll give you an example from grammar. I mean, we teach students the present progressive is used for something you're doing right now, right? But you could also say, well, this week I'm walking to work because my car is broken. Well, I'm not walking right now, but it's something that's sort of temporarily habitual, right? So I think it's worth starting with that sort of prototypical example, and then as they gain proficiency, maybe branch outward from that. But trying to sort of say, okay, here's the word cover, and here's every meaning sense right away for the learners would be overwhelming. So I think it makes some sense to be measured in how you present these things to learners.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you too.
I think maybe we have time for one more question.
Oh, sorry, I should have explained what corpus means.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Everyone's being so helpful and jumping into the chat. I guess does anyone have, because I have a question, but I don't want to ask unless everyone's been given an opportunity to ask before me. Okay, so I guess for the final question will be mine. It's a very small question in a way. So I was really curious about you had the actual test groups, so the 2 control groups and then the test group. And there was a graph that you showed with the changes in response times. Mm-hmm. And the one that was really striking to me was how in the large difference, the largest difference, the least proficient learners took the longest time to make their decision, right? There was like a climb that was quite steep. And I was just wondering if you had any kind of thought for why that was the case, because it just kind of struck me that that there must be some sort of cognitive, I think it's the next slide. I believe the next slide.
This one here?
Yeah, right. So if you look at the large difference, the least proficient speakers took a long time to make their decision, much longer than they took even for medium difference and for same difference. And I was wondering, were they in that instance more likely to be incorrect in their answer? Because this doesn't it doesn't tell you whether they were correct or not, simply how long it took them to make that distinction. Right. So I was wondering about that. It's a very small question, but yeah.
I actually had another slide in here that I took out, but I think one thing has to do with how are they perceiving the goals of the task, right? And that's, of course, the foundational aspect of this study is like, are they seeing that their goal is to find the smaller of the 2 rooms or the more narrow of the 2 rooms? And I guess maybe if you think about this large difference, and when the large difference gets, so for the large difference, it's harder for them. Let me see, I'm confusing myself now. So they took more time to respond when they were less proficient, right? And they're looking at this from a perspective of area, right? So it's kind of, if you can imagine, they're not really thinking about the width, but if you assume that the lower level learners are sort of conceptualizing this more like semi, they're not really concerned with the difference in width as they are the overall area. And obviously the width is related to the area, but not necessarily in a really straightforward way. And I'm going to just quickly pull up another slide here that let me stop sharing for a second. If we have time, if not, then we can move on. But I took it out of the initial presentation because I had too much stuff. Let's see. This might help to sort of answer your question a little bit. Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen again. So this was actually looking at the probability of selection in narrow room with proficiency shown in these 3 lines and the area difference shown here. Okay, so I don't know how well you can see that, but basically what it shows is that when the area difference was small, all groups of all proficiencies had about the same probability of selecting the narrower room. But as the area difference became greater, the higher proficiency learners tended to choose the narrower room much more common. So this is the higher proficiency and the sort of average proficiency and the lower proficiency. So I don't know, that kind of gets at your question, I think, in terms of just like, how did that play into their selections? And I think what we can see here is that the higher proficiency do definitely choose the narrow room more frequently. But it's also sort of conditioned by differences in area, whereas the differences in area get greater, they tend to magnify their difference in choosing the more narrow room. I hope that answered your question.
No, that was really illuminating. Thank you. Well, we are actually out of time. So just before everyone rushes off to their weekends, I did put in the chat, we have a listserv, which is a great way for keeping up with all the great events in linguistics events at ASU. It's really easy to sign up. You can just send an email to listserv@lists.asu.edu with no subject. And in the email body, you just put subscribe ASU link, and then you put your name and you replace the word name with your specific name. There's also, if you are able to access, if you have an ASU account, you can also register for listservs through ASU's specific listserv portal. So thank you again so much, Professor Wolter. This was so illuminating. And if you have other questions for Professor Wolter that you couldn't think of, but you really want to ask, send them to me, and we will find an answer for you. So I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and just a huge hand again to Professor Wolter for this wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you so much for coming. And
thank you to everyone for taking the time, and I hope you have a good weekend.
Yes. Okay. All right. Everyone, bye-bye.
Bye.
Awesome. I think that's great. Now I stop recording.